All right, welcome everyone to the Serious Angler podcast, where, as always, our main course for you guys is talking and hopefully teaching you more about bass fishing. And we are back with exactly that, and it's another edition of the Real Biology segment here at Serious Angler. I'm your host, Bailey Egbert, and hosting with me is our favorite fisheries biologist, Mr. Stephen Barden. Steve, how's it going, man?
Hey Bailey, how are you, brother? It's excellent. It's excellent. It is a great time to be doing fisheries work. You know, it's mid-February, beautiful weather. For some reason, we're warm, unseasonably warm, so we're actually out doing work.
That's good. That's good to hear. Uh,
Yeah.
well, I could say the opposite up here. It's very unseasonably cold. I think this is probably one of the colder winters we've had in a long time, which I think is actually a good thing. I don't know. I'd refer to you on that. But I'd say like at least for us, it's good from the industry side because our ice fishing folk are
Okay.
making more money. There's more ice fishing being done, so obviously that some of the tackle shop, like especially the small mom and pop tackle shops, they make their money on the ice fishing season.
Okay.
Um, but so it's good in that regard. But I feel like the spring fishing once it comes ice out typically is better the longer the ice season is.
I totally agree. Yeah, up north, you need cold weather. You need ice. Maybe the ice isn't exactly important, but you need cold weather. That is what allows those fish to have a long lifespan. It also keeps angling pressure down. It makes y'all's fishery so special. In the south, we need winter too because we need the grass to quit growing. All the aquatic vegetation dies off during the winter. We need that to happen. So we do need winter, but it's been unseasonably warm. We did a habitat project at Lake Conroe for Major League Fishing, and it was 75 degrees, and then the following week it was in the 80s all week. So we're not really getting that long projected winter. We're getting these short bursts of cold, and then right back to kind of these spring-like conditions, and that's going to allow vegetation to grow and be really dense this year. Where it sounds like y'all are more of a normal season or even a colder season, to where I think y'all's fishing will be really good in the spring.
I'm thinking so with this trend anyway. It's usually good anyways as it is, but yeah, especially with this prolonged ice season, I think it'll be good. So it's good to hear about that though. I'm excited to head down your way here in a couple weeks to good old
Oh
Texas.
yeah,
But
you're coming to fish what? You're going to fish fork for competition, and then I think you and I have discussed Boat Arc. We've discussed Lake Athens, some of those East Texas fisheries that you can launch the kayak and have either big fish days or numbers fish days, but opportunities abound. That's really cool, and I think
yeah,
I'll probably be able to get you into the Freshwater Fishery Center. You know it's closed, but we talked to Tom and Natalie on that last episode, and they're excited to get to meet you and maybe give you a behind the scenes tour of that.
I would I would do anything to be present for one of the feedings. So,
Yeah, listen, they undersold it. There is possibly a 20-pound largemouth sitting at the fishery center right now in a round tank eating rainbow trout, and there may be multiple in the tank together.
oh my god,
Yeah,
that's
it's pretty cool.
unbelievable.
Pretty
That'd
cool.
be like the greatest heist of all time if somebody could like kidnap that and try to claim it as the world record.
It'd be unbelievable. Well, I mean, the fishery center. I mean, as long as it's caught by somebody with a license, I don't know. That's public water.
I was gonna say if I went in there and cast it and caught one, would it count?
As long as you got a license, just make sure you got that.
Yeah, that's. I'm curious though. Like if they grow it, like I'm obviously speaking theoretics here, but like grow it to 25 pounds, right? Something
Okay.
outrageous. Can they like then claim it? It's the world record because technically it's in captivity. I don't
Well,
know.
it has to be caught on a public body of water. That's, I mean, IGFA. Everybody's been pretty strict on the fact that it needs to be public body water. It can't be private water. And I would consider a fish hatchery private water. I mean, I would consider that an engineered fish. And we've seen fish that size before. Of course, in California, we saw Dottie. She exceeded. Well, she hit 25 pounds before later on being caught much smaller before she died. But I mean, we know that we know that Florida largemouth could get that big, so it's not impossible. If it escaped the hatchery, though, it would go into Lake Athens. So maybe on your visit to the hatchery, you bring
And
it to
there's a
Lake
little
Athens,
bit.
you catch it the next day. Yeah, yeah. Prove it, prove it, prove it, prove it.
Call it Bass Gate. Steve's gonna
Yeah,
steal the fish
exactly.
for me. Yeah.
Hey, you still got to catch it, and I'm not so certain it's not going to pull your kayak around half the lake.
Hey, that's fine. That's fine. Bring it on. Bring it on. Well, yeah.
Well, let's
Either way,
see.
looking forward
Yeah,
to getting down there. But
yeah, I can't wait.
we said on this show the main course for serious angler in general is obviously trying to teach more about bass fishing and the regular serious angler, the OG serious angler shows. You got Andy, you got Deacon, myself. We always typically have a guest, and there's always some great nuggets, great information that's dropped. But I think the epitome of teaching people about bass fishing has become this real biology segment because we are getting so much great scientific information from folks like yourself, but also the different biologists and different folks in that side of the industry on this show. And so we have that and then some for with today's guest. I kind of give the folks a little preview of what today's show is going to look like.
Yep, this is one of those people that I've been telling you about them for years, Bailey. There are scientists across this country that are putting their head down and doing their work, and they're extraordinary. And whenever we discussed building this podcast, that was one of the things I wanted to introduce the public to those people. So you're gonna meet a guest today, Shane Bush, fisheries biologist for Missouri Department of Conservation. I met him in 2019, was immediately impressed by him. I've seen him at conferences and heard him present, and he's doing well. He has a history of work on Table Rock Lake, which is one of my favorite fisheries, and you'll hear about that. But he's incorporating like old school history and data from the 70s and the 80s into technology from today, and he's making decisions on that fishery and how to improve it using all of that information. And he's working with anglers. He's one of those biologists that really epitomizes what we all want in a fishery scientist. And after you hear from him, you're going to trust the things he's saying because you will hear that he knows his facts about the fishery. He's making sound recommendations based on those facts. And he's just genuinely a great person to talk to. I think everybody's going to enjoy this.
Like, yeah, well, I can assure the folks there's going to be a lot of very, very insightful knowledge dropped on this one. So make sure you pay close attention. It might even need to be one where you need to run it back and watch or listen a second or third time because there's some really valuable information, some things on strategy to build fisheries, adjustments to make on fisheries, and a lot of things, not even just bass related, that it's discussed in this one. So, Steve, I think without further ado, should we get into the episode of Mr. Shane Bush?
Yeah, let's see how it went.
All right. Steve, we are here with our guest, Mr. Shane Bush. Would you like to, I guess, give the folks tuning in a proper intro before Shane kind of gives himself a little elevator pitch to the folks?
Absolutely. Shane and I met 2019. Whenever you think about real biology in the podcast, and Bailey and I were discussing it, this is that biologist I'm telling you we're going to introduce you to. Shane's a biologist. He's one of my favorites in the country to work with. Every time I go to a conference, Shane is there. And most of the time he's presenting. He's presenting on, you're not going to believe how many habitats he's put into his reservoirs. But Shane manages what I would say, we talked to Tom and Natalie last time about trophy fisheries. And Shane manages what I would say is the best recreational fishery in the entire country. A fishery where you can go catch 3 species of black bass in one day. You can catch crappie. You can catch walleye. It's unbelievable, and it's all under Shane's management and has been for several years. So I'm excited to talk to Shane, one of the best biologists in the country, and he's from the state of Missouri. So it's gonna be a good talk. Shane, welcome to the show, buddy.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. Looking forward to it.
Yeah. Well, let's kind of start
Yes,
diving into things, Steve. What we got in the
yeah,
docket?
Shane. Well, I mean, first let's let Shane introduce himself. What's your title at the department, Shane? And then I really want to go into before you got there. What's the path look like?
Yeah, so I'm a fisheries biologist is my title. I manage Lake Taneycomo and Table Rock Lake, amongst some other things here in Southwest Missouri. I've been the biologist down here since 2008. Prior to that, I've worked several other jobs within MDC as a fisheries technician. I've worked in the science branch. I've worked with wildlife. So, kind of putting the feelers out after I graduated college and then found out that fisheries was definitely the path I wanted to pursue within the agency. So, yeah, just been the management biologist here for, like I said, since 2007, and we always had aspirations to move back to the Kansas City area. But after a couple of years in Southwest Missouri on Table Rock, it was clear that this is where we wanted to stay, raise a family. So we've been out here ever since and loving every minute of it.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So almost 20 years there at Table Rock. So you were originally from Kansas City area, though?
Yeah, I was born and raised in Blue Springs, a suburb of Kansas City. Went to college at Northwest Missouri State and got my wildlife degree there. And then after that, just started working jobs with the agency, with MDC. So again, science, research, wildlife, and then landed my first salaried fisheries job in St. Joseph, which is in northern Missouri.
Hmm.
And then the fisheries biologist job opened in southern Missouri, and my boss asked if I was going to apply for it, and I thought, I don't want to move to Branson. You hear Branson,
Right.
this busy hustle and bustle, but he looked at me and he said, "If you want to promote, you will." And it was
Mhm.
the best advice I ever received because you've got to take those opportunities as a fisheries professional. You've got to maybe move. Maybe it's not where you want to stay forever, but maybe in my instance, you may find out you love it, and it's a
Right.
great career move. So, yeah, we moved down here and been doing it since.
So in your position, how many other employees or other biologists do you have that work with you out of your office?
So yeah, within our region, I think there's 5 other biologists. We've got quite a lot of resources in
Mhm.
Southwest Missouri. A lot of reservoirs down here, a lot of rivers. Smallmouth bass, clear stream rivers. We've got trout fisheries, so we've got a really diversified fishing opportunities down here, and we have biologists for each one of those water bodies. So. Again, mine is Table Rock Lake and Lake Taneycomo. For those that aren't familiar, Lake Taneycomo is our state's largest trout fishery. It's the tailwater of Table Rock Lake. So cold water year round. We grow some really good rainbow trout there that are all stocked from the MDC hatchery system and the federal
Mhm.
hatchery system. And then within my office, we also have a sport fish ecologist. It's a science, more on the research side of things. So he and I work on a lot of different projects together. So it's just a great work team. We've been able to do so much. We work great together. We need other hands on deck for sampling or fish habitat work. Everybody's good to chip in. And so, yeah, I can't really say enough about the agency itself. MDC is a great outfit to work for. They've been great for me for my career. Great mentors, other biologists, but also supervisors I've had, in the fisheries field. Um, so it's a great agency, a great region to work in.
Yeah, and Table Rock, that's one of the largest reservoirs. So as a new biologist coming in, if you remember back, how did it feel? What was it like knowing that you were going to be in charge of Table Rock?
Thing. I mean, you do. You look at the sheer size of it. Table Rock's 43,000 acres. Yeah, it's kind of where do you go from that from a management standpoint, and what do you really have the ability to control? Because in a reservoir like that, there's certain species you can stock, and you can make the fishery better by stocking paddlefish, walleye. But bass, we're not stocking bass; those are naturally reproducing. So how do you manage that system to get the best quality bass fishery you can get out of it? That's Stephen. I mean, that's a daunting task with what are your tools at your disposal. So it's anglers, harvest regulations, habitat. Those are the things that we can directly control. And so that's what we spent a lot of time on Table Rock. As you're aware, we've done a lot of large scale fish habitat work on the lake and just replenishing that older, deteriorating fish habitat. Table Rock was built in 1958, so a lot of the wood in the lake is rotting away. we work with Bass Pro Shops and other partners to really build that back up. And, it really does seem to be making a difference on at least anglers catching more fish, and being able to have areas to catch fish where they can target them, fish are congregated. And then regulations wise, we could probably get into that here in a little bit. But those are really the tools at our disposal. So, yeah, I guess it's not as hard as people might think it is, especially when you have good
Mhm.
team members, a good agency, good support from administration, but and a good angler base. The anglers that we have, the bass anglers, they care about the fishery. Anglers want to see what's best for the fishery, and even the trout on Lake Taneycomo. We all want the same things. We all want big fish. We all want plentiful fish. So just working with them to streamline the way we do things has been great. We've had some great partners. Yourself, Gary. A lot of different angling groups around the lake have helped us with a lot of things. So yeah.
Yeah, so let's kind of dive into it. We've got this reservoir. You said natural reproducing bass population. How do you, this is our third episode of the podcast, so we're still our audience is still learning. Let's talk about how we survey a reservoir and get into the details of Table Rock. What are your survey methods? How do you do it? Where do you site select? All those things.
Yeah. Yeah, for years, they just selected certain coves in the lake that they spring electrofishing is how we target the bass populations. Boat mounted electrofishing. So they shock the same coves over and over and over for years. Well, that gives you good data, good trend data, but really what that gives you more is like, here's what's happening in these coves in the lake year after year after year. So that's probably about 6, 7 years ago, following what Arkansas did on their White River lakes. We started doing more of a randomized site selection. So within the different arms of the lake, there's 5 different arms of the lake. We sample all of them every spring, and so we started randomizing, 600-meter segments of the shoreline to include not only coves that we always shocked, but points and bluffs and just varied habitat types. And observationally, I'm seeing, those different habitat types holding different sizes of fish that time of year. You might not get a lot of fish on a long gravel flat when you're shocking, but most of them are going to be really big. So it's we've kind of randomized it throughout the lake in those areas, and just follow the trend data over time, and we can really see we catch 300 to 400 bass per hour of electrofishing, which, if you're not on the fisheries world, is a very high catch rate. But we have largemouth, smallmouth, and spotted bass in the lake, so that's all 3 species combined. But as Stephen said, it is a tremendous recreational fishery because we have very high bass densities. And so we can look at the trends of those species over time, look at the links. We can see when big year classes are produced. And generally, at least with largemouth and spotted bass, equate that back to probably a high water spring or a high water summer where those fish had a lot of available cover to survive, a lot of food. So yeah, just tracking that over time and looking at the size and seeing how that's changing. And you know, for in particular spotted bass, we have noticed some trends over time that the number of spotted bass in the lake is increasing, and the size structure of the spotted bass is decreasing. And in the fisheries world, that means your fish are starting to get stockpiled. They're not growing as well as they should, and we probably need to consider taking some more of those out. So using that great long-term data set. I mean, we've got a data set dating back to the 70s and 80s. So we
Right.
know pretty well what's going on when we're catching 2, 3,000 bass every spring. That's a pretty good sample size to tell us what's happening. So we're going to be looking at lowering the spotted bass link limit in Table Rock to allow more harvest of those spotted bass because not only based on electrofishing catch rates and size structure, we've also done a lot of aging, working with Missouri State University. Quentin Phelps and Haykim there have been tremendous partners, aged so many bass and crappie for us over the years. They've been a tremendous asset. And what we found was that those spotted bass are not getting to 15 inches before the end of their life. And so while some do break that barrier and get that, we have a 15-inch minimum length limit in place for spotted, largemouth, and smallmouth right now. So it may not be the best regulation, based on what we're seeing in that data. So that's how we use that data over time to make informed, educated decisions that will benefit the fishery.
Yeah, so a lot to unpack there, Shane. you, you got so much. We covered so much ground. I want to reel us back just a hair. Um, let's walk through electrofishing real quick. Do y'all do daytime or nighttime electrofishing?
Okay, nighttime electrofishing. Yep, our water's so
Nighttime.
clear that we
Okay.
just don't get very good catch rates during the day.
So clarity is a big issue when you're electrofishing. Also boat traffic. I assume that there's
Yeah,
quite a few anglers on Table Rock,
yeah,
especially in the
yeah,
spring.
yeah.
Um, so you do nighttime, or y'all are doing random sample. How long is each run that you're doing?
Typically 10 to 12-minute runs. We randomly selected 600-meter segments of the
Right.
shoreline. And so, yeah, we do
Yeah.
10 to 12 of those a night. So about 2 hours of electrofishing per arm is what we get.
And so to do them all, I mean, you're talking about a week long process.
Yeah, usually
Week
takes,
to 2 weeks.
with weather delays and rescheduling, about 2 weeks out of the spring is how much time we spend out there. Yep.
And then over that time, we got 2 to 3 thousand bass that are caught. You're also seeing, I mean, anything that's in that population. So you're seeing your sunfish, your shad, crappie, and whenever you're electrofishing, you're doing what all of us do as fishery scientists. You're collecting every single fish. You're looking at links. Are y'all getting weights or just links?
We take weights as well. Yes.
So links and weights, plus identifying species, and then all released back in to the reservoir unless there's another question to answer. You mentioned one of those questions, which is age. So walk us through, how do you age a fish?
Yeah, yeah. So we collected those fish that we aged through electrofishing, and we like to get 5 of each half-inch group. So that gives us a very good idea because fish are individuals. They grow differently. So we want to get a wide range of sizes, but also a good number of fish in the same size. So collect those fish, take them back, and then we, of course, get the length and weights on them, and then we pull their otolith, which is an inner ear bone. It's got rings on it, just like a tree. So you can look at that under a microscope and count how many years that fish has been alive, basically. And so, yeah, we've put all that into, FAMs or other fisheries databases that we have to model out the population based on the electrofishing catch rates, the size structure, the growth rates, mortality, all that stuff. We pull that into models to determine what the best regulations would be for managing those.
Yeah, so we're looking at the electrofishing trend. You're seeing, you said specifically for spotted bass, you're catching more individuals. But I think one of the most interesting things you said is you're catching more spotted bass, but when you age them, you're finding out that over their lifespan, so 10 years, is that roughly what a spotted bass would?
Yeah, probably
10
max.
years.
Yeah.
Okay, so over 10-year time in Table Rock, they're not growing to 15 inches, which means they don't reach the legal harvest limit ever in their lifetime.
Yeah. So some do, right? Some do. And
Yeah,
I'm
of
not
course.
discounting that because, I'll get that from anglers and they tell me they do. But we aged some of those as well. And, the growths were all over the ages were all over the board. So a good example is a 15.5-inch spotted bass could be anywhere from 5 to 12 years old.
So
So,
then, if you're saying that some of them could be 5 years old in 15 inches or greater, then those are the fastest growing spotted bass for whatever reason. They are
yeah,
more aggressive, they have better growth rate, whatever reason. And those are the ones that currently are being harvested. And the ones that aren't being harvested are the ones that are growing slower and not getting to 15 inches by the time they're 10, right?
right, right. So the
Okay.
vast majority of the population is struggling to get to that 15-inch mark. Yeah, and that varies too based on where you go in the lake. We talked about what a big system that it is.
Mm.
Growth rates tend to be better on the main lake, the clearer sections of the main lake, but we also don't have as high bass densities in those areas. So you get further up the river arms, you have higher numbers of bass, higher numbers of spotted bass, and we see slower growth in those areas too, because more competition for food up there.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Yep.
So, as a manager, you mentioned already there's the number one tool to change a population is going to be that harvest regulation. So, what are y'all proposing to do for spotted bass?
Yeah, so we're going to lower the length limit from 15 inches to 12 inches because spotted bass grow pretty well up to about 8 to 10 inches and then they really start to slow down. So most all the spotted bass that we aged are getting to 12 inches. So that, you know, it allows anglers the opportunity to harvest
Right.
bass should they want to, and there are anglers that want to. In fact, I've been approached by several anglers, which is kind of what started all of this.
Mhm.
And I thought, well, we need to take a little closer look at this and make sure that we're on with what we think the ages these fish are. And that had changed over time once we started aging them. So there are anglers that want to keep bass, and this allows them the opportunity to do that because spotted bass are probably the most plentiful fish in Table Rock Lake.
Right. Yeah, and it sounds like it would help if the anglers would harvest more of them. That would, you said the main lake has less density and the fish are bigger. Well, we harvested more fish out of the tributaries, then in theory, those fish would be bigger. I mean, that is how it works. That's how density works.
Exactly. Yeah, and all three species of bass would benefit from reducing the total numbers of those as well. That's going to be more
Right.
food availability for everybody.
Yeah. So you're judging that based on electrofishing density. Is there? I think I know the answer to this, but is there something you're doing to assess anglers and the number of fish they're catching and the number of fish they're harvesting, those kind of things?
Yeah. We've also conducted angler creel surveys as well. We try to do those every 6 years. It's been a minute since we did one in Table Rock. The last one was done in 2013. But what we noticed looking at trend data with that as well is that the number of legal size 15-inch spotted bass that anglers were catching had also decreased. So it wasn't just us. In our electrofishing, anglers were seeing fewer and fewer as well. And when you look at bass harvest rates over time, and we're talking angler creel data going back to the 70s, I think everybody that knows anything about bass fishing would agree that fewer bass are being harvested now than they once were. And as most fisheries managers would tell you, fish need to be harvested in order to maintain healthy populations. So if we're seeing decreases in harvest, it would only help to explain the increases in the total number of fish in the lake.
Oh yeah, that's spot on, Shane. This is perfect. This is exact Bailey. This is why I told you Shane would be the perfect guest because
Mm.
he has the best recreational fishery in the country. They got up to date surveys that show the population's increasing and 40, 50 years of data that says our anglers aren't harvesting fish like they once were. And therefore, we have more fish and those fish are smaller and they're growing slower. So, as a bass fisherman, Bailey, you're coming already to the assumption we need to harvest some fish to make them grow.
Yeah, and I've been hearing this message become louder and louder, and like obviously, in part of the angler community is like, oh, if you kill it or you keep a bass, like you're a murderer. Like it's like this taboo thing, of keeping a bass where it's. But I've been hearing the message become much more well received and spread as of maybe the past year to 2 years of trying to enforce keeping more fish, harvesting more bass, so that exactly what you've been talking about, Shane. Um, and I think it's one I'm gonna try to start actually doing this. You're granted here, I'm from the north, and our fisheries are great for now, but I think it's one of you got to practice what you preach. So definitely one I'd love to get involved in. My one question to you, because I know there's going to be some anglers listening to this that are thinking the same thing, is from the electroshocking and obviously having that much data and that amount of fish density. I'm curious, just from you guys' experience, like how often you see the three different species cohabitating, like when you're doing the electroshocking.
Often, yeah. I mean, so we're catching largemouth and spots together, all the time. I mean, obviously not paired up together like a spawning pair, but in the same areas, yeah. Smallmouth is a little bit different story. Smallmouth are tricky. They spawn very deep. They hang out in the main sections of the lake where it's clear, and they also spawn in very deep of water. We've done snorkel surveys in the spring, and we've found smallmouth bass nests in 8 to 10 foot of water. Well, we can't electrofish that deep. In fact, some years it's so clear you'll just drive right over the fish sitting on a bed, and it won't even touch them. You're thinking, how am I going to get a population sample of this fish? We can't catch them. And this is a good plug to put in for where Steven comes in. You know, it's kind of how we met, was a Major League Fishing tournament. And we were able to get all of that data that was collected through that tournament for the bass in the lake. So every fish over a pound, he sent me the data for. And we were able to work with our biometricians to create a formula based on the length and weight information we had from our electrofishing to convert that into links. And so I was able to create these great link frequency distribution graphs, which basically just shows you the number of fish of each size throughout the population. And it was very comparable with the largemouth and the spotted bass of what we see in our electrofishing surveys. What was really cool was that we don't catch maybe a dozen smallmouth bass in a spring electrofishing survey for the reasons I mentioned. In the Major League Fishing data, I think we had somewhere in the neighborhood of like 1,500 smallmouth bass. So it painted an excellent picture of what that population looked like throughout the lake, and just another method that we were able to use to assess the population. So, man, I wish you guys would come back every year.
I wish we would too.
I mean, that was tremendous data that I just wish. And so we've been kind of working with that too. We've got some workers right now in our office that have been working with some different bass tournaments on the lake to try to obtain some of that data, you know, and just look at trends over time, just help us manage the populations.
And what Shane's talking about, Bailey, is that first season of Bass Pro Tour, Table Rock was on the schedule, and we went there. And the guys caught 6,500 fish or so. It was the 1 pound minimum, so they really caught a lot of fish. And then they were scheduled to go to Grand Lake 3 weeks later. And then we had the flood. And so we rescheduled back to Table Rock. And so we got another 5,000, 6,000 fish catches. So, Shane ended up with like 11,000 or 12,000, which, think about the numbers that Shane said, in a season of electrofishing, spring season, that's 2,000 to 3,000 fish catches that he gets. And it's mainly spotted bass and largemouth. And it's all size classes. So it includes those fish that are 6 inches that are recruits from the last year. It also includes those fish that are older in the population. With Major League Fishing, what we ended up with is 1 pound fish or greater, and roughly 12,000 fish. So that's kind of like 4 years of electrofishing data handed to you at one time. And for some states, like Shane said, whenever you electrofish Table Rock and you're catching that many fish, that's a high number. Fishery scientists that are listening to this, they're going, whoa, we catch 100 to 200, bass per hour in our electrofishing if we're lucky. So for a lot of states, whenever Major League Fishing comes, it's more like 10 years of electrofishing data that you get from 1 week of an event. It's unbelievable what we can do. And Shane's shared, and I've seen some presentations of different maps of where those fish catches were, and then also associated with the habitat. And we're going to get deep into habitat shortly, but it's really cool to see Major League Fishing, and now that you're using local anglers to assess those smallmouth. And I've even heard other states are kind of doing the same thing, Shane. So I appreciate you preaching the gospel of how cool that format is.
Yeah, it's just a tremendous data set, and not only just for the numbers of fish, but the size of fish. And I'll admit that our electrofishing does not always catch the biggest fish in the population. And I'm sure Stephen would agree with that as well. I mean, anybody that samples fish populations regularly, your bigger fish are spawning deeper. So at least in Table Rock. And so we don't catch a lot of them. Shocking. But with that tournament data, we were able to get some of those larger size classes of fish in the population sample as well. So when combined with our electrofishing data, it just created a tremendous tool and data set for us to use. So yeah, I mean, I'll lobby for y'all to come back every year. So I need to talk to.
Okay. You gave us some really cool data on smallmouth or spotted bass. Do we have similar data for largemouth? Like how long, at 10 years old, what is their average length? Do you have any of that as well?
Yeah, we've got a good data set of age and growth information for largemouth, and so largemouth grow very well. We've not noticed a decline in the largemouth bass growth over time. It's remained pretty steady with its ups and downs, but pretty steady. So largemouth take about 4 years to get to the 15-inch minimum length limit.
Mhm.
So a 15-inch is appropriate for that, but it's not
Yeah,
always
it sounds like
appropriate
it.
for all the bass species. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Looking at the data that you said sent us, I mean, you're growing 20-inch largemouth in 7 years, and then of course those fish will live, 7 to even 10 years as well. So you're getting plenty of time for them to be in that quality or trophy size class.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I guess for smallmouth, you probably don't have as much data just because of the low catch rates during electrofishing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, we
That
got to
makes
use
sense.
angler creel data or tournament data really to get at that. So we don't get it every year,
Yeah.
but just observationally and talking to anglers throughout the year, it stays pretty steady. Smallmouth fishing stays pretty steady, so they do well and they grow well. So no concerns there really.
Yeah. Well, and Bailey, I didn't mention this whenever we were talking about putting the podcast together, but I'm interested in other species beyond bass. So tell me about the crappie. How are y'all assessing crappie? Same thing for walleye. I'd love to hear the story of the entire fishery.
Yeah, yeah. Crappie, we get some electrofishing in the spring. Mainly it's your larger reproducing individuals that are up shallow spawning. We use nets in the fall. We use lead nets, which
Okay.
is kind of just a big hoop nets tied together with a long lead. The fish hit it, swim into
Hold on.
them.
They don't know what a hoop net is.
Yeah,
Let's
all right.
describe this. So let's
Uh,
see. It's some metal rings that have a mesh that lead to a tunnel kind of thing, a funnel, and your fish would swim down the center of it, and then they would just get trapped inside this long consecutive metal ring after metal ring that finally ends in a point. And what Shane said is they also have leads to them. So imagine 40 foot of seine or something, a mesh that runs to the left and the right of the hoop net. So when the crappie start to swim, they swim in a school. When they start to swim, they just get funneled into the center of that net. And then you wouldn't believe it. You don't have to bait them. You just set this net out, and then you wake up the next morning, it's full of crappie. It's pretty unbelievable.
yeah. Yeah, so we use that for assessing the crappie populations and get at, what year class strength of the crappie populations are. And same as what we talked about with bass, we use that
Mm-hmm.
information to define regulations, what the regulations should be. We also do age and growth, which again, I worked with Quentin and Hay at MSU to age 400 crappie in the lake. And this was a time when backtrack 4 or 5 years, live scope's just starting to come out. Anglers are
Right.
coming to us with concerns about live scope. So we aged a bunch of crappie, and what we found is they're very fast growing in Table Rock. There's a 10
Okay.
inch minimum length limit, and both black and white crappie are hitting 10 inches in about 2.5 years. So that's very fast growth. Typically,
Mm-hmm.
with fast growing species, you get shorter lifespans, so they're only living about 6, 7 years. So with fast growing populations, I'm not as concerned about the impacts that live scope might have on them because we are protecting fish during their first year of life or year two of life when they're spawning.
Mm-hmm.
So they're reaching sexual maturity at a year and a half, 2 years old, and that's 9.5 inches. So they can't be harvested then in the spring. So we consistently see fish reproducing, recruiting into the population. So, live scope isn't as big of a concern there, in my opinion, for a fast growing fish like that.
Man, that's great. That is great insight.
If we get to it and there's time, we'll maybe talk about paddlefish, the paddle fishery that we
Right.
have in the lake. But when we start talking about forward-facing sonar for that, you're talking about a very long-lived, slow-growing fish. Where
Mm-hmm.
a legal-sized paddlefish it takes them about 8 years to get to 34 inches, and a 70 or 80 pound fish might be 20 years old. So if anglers are consistently ripping out our 80 and 90 pound fish with live scope, we're going to probably see some impacts to the larger fish in that population, whereas crappie
Mm.
grow so fast the smaller ones can come up and make up those bigger year classes quicker or those bigger fish quicker. So, but yeah, the other species, going back to the other species in Table Rock, paddlefish is one that we maintain by stocking. So
Okay.
there's 3 reservoirs in Missouri that we stock paddlefish in: Lake of the Ozarks, Truman, and Table Rock Lake. So we collect those from the rivers and the lakes, spawn them in our hatchery system, and stock them out about 6 to 8 inches in the reservoirs. So again, 34 inches is what it takes them to get to the legal size limit. And we have a snagging season from March 15th to April 30th where anglers can come and catch those. So that's really a unique fishery in Table Rock.
The forward-facing sonar and snagging paddlefish does seem like a way to exploit a population pretty quickly.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, those that are good at it are very good at it, and they are exploiting those larger fish in the population. So we as an agency are tasked with how do we combat that? We're not going to ban the technology, likely. I mean, that doesn't seem like the best solution. I think as biologists, that kind of falls on the weight of our shoulders to implement regulations to protect those fish more. So we're looking at some different things. We've got a paddlefish working group within the agency, comprised of a lot of different researchers, scientists, and biologists that manage these species, putting all our heads together, putting all the data together, try to come up with the best solutions. So more to come on that, but we're currently in the process of conducting another exploitation study, or basically an easier term is harvest. So we've been putting jaw tags, metal jaw bands in paddlefish, and when anglers return those, we get information off of how many fish are being harvested in the population every year. So we've been spending a lot of time over the last month or two netting paddlefish. We were just out last week, when we've tagged about 400 paddlefish in Table Rock so far this year, just to try to get an idea of updated numbers of harvest compared to, we did this study about 10 years ago before forward facing sonar. So this study will give us an update of what does the population look like now? What's the size of fish anglers are harvesting or targeting now? So yeah, we've been on the lake doing a lot of that this winter.
And I
We caught
guess
a
whenever you, sorry, Shane, I was going to ask, whenever the angler catches one and calls in that had a jaw tag, you're asking them specifically, are you using forward-facing sonar or not?
We are. We are. So, along with this study, too, we'll also be doing an in person angler creel survey during the snagging season. And we'll be asking anglers, are you using forward facing sonar? What method are you using? So then we can see, the fish that they caught, the size of fish they caught, and how that compares with anglers using traditional methods, just to get a better feel and better idea for what's happening out there.
When
So when
you
you
are doing
say
your,
by the,
David,
sorry,
sorry.
Steve, by the in person, you mean like you guys are actually getting out on the boats and going to check each boat's in boots on the ground?
It'll be an access creel, so we'll be sitting at the boat ramps when anglers come in with their catch, to weigh and measure those fish, and then ask them information about their fishing trip, how much time they spent, that sort of thing. So yeah, we'll
Awesome.
run that through the entire snagging season this year. Yeah, at all 3
Awesome.
reservoirs. Yeah.
Cool.
That's exactly the question I was going to ask, Bailey. Perfect.
There you go.
So now you've given us crappie paddlefish. What about walleye? Tell us about the
Walleye,
walleye fishery.
yeah. The walleye fishery in Table Rock's pretty unique because we stock it sometimes. We stock it with supplemental fish from the hatchery system when we have extra, but it's not on our standard list of lakes to stock every year, like Bull Shoals or Stockton Lake that get high numbers of walleye from our hatchery system every year. Most of the walleye in Table Rock are naturally reproduced in the lake, which isn't that common for larger reservoirs. Um, it really any inland reservoir, I'd say, in southern part of the U.S. doesn't have a lot of reproducing walleye, but Table Rock does, and so we've had a lot of high water over the past 10, 12 years. We've had really wet springs, and when we get that high water, we get a lot of runoff, a lot of water in the tributaries where those fish are going to spawn, where those walleye are going to spawn. And so it just equates into these big year classes of fish produced, optimal spawning conditions, optimal habitat. And then we'll see those fish 2, 3 years later in our sampling, which is also electrofishing, is how we target walleye. And we can equate those big year classes of fish back to those high water events. So because of all the high water we've had, the walleye fishery in Table Rock is probably as good as it's ever been right now, numbers wise and also size. They grow fast as well. We've been working with an angler, one of the bigger guides on the lake, to get a lot of age data from him. So he's saving all the walleye that they clean on a guided trip, and we're getting the otoliths out of them to determine how they're growing. Just for all the reasons we've talked about already. Walleye, same way. We need to know. We don't have a really good data set for how quick they grow. We know they grow pretty fast. 18 inches is the minimum length limit. Some of them are getting that in about 3 years, but others it's taken them a little longer. So goes back to where you're at in the lake, the different arms, but trying to get a more holistic picture of what the population and what growth looks like so we can then go in with regulations and, propose the best regulations that are going to protect this naturally reproducing fishery. If it was a put and take fishery 100% like a lot of our other lakes, it'd be a lot easier because, well, you need more fish, you just stock more fish, right? Well, when you're dealing with naturally reproduced fish, you've got to use those harvest rates or the regulations to manage those. So, but the walleye population looks really good right now. We sample that by going up in the rivers in the spring and doing electrofishing when they're up there spawning, and give us good numbers of what the reproducing population looks like. And then trying to think of other species to discuss.
Well, I got a question
Yeah,
for you.
all right.
What are all these fish eating?
Yeah. Table Rock has a tremendous shad population. We have both gizzard and threadfin shad, which makes it unique in Missouri in that the threadfin shad actually survive through the winters. We've tried stocking them in our other reservoirs north of Table Rock, and they might do well for a few years, and then we get a really cold winter and they all die out. Because their thermal tolerance is much lower than that of gizzard shad, or much higher, I guess you'd say. So we have both threadfin and gizzards, and I think that's really the primary contributor to why our fish grow so well. And I don't know, it would be a topic for you and I to discuss sometime at length as to like, I get this a lot from anglers. Like, we have so many shad, right? We have so many shad. You look on your graph about any given time, there's just balls of shad everywhere. So why aren't the spotted bass growing bigger? Why aren't they exceeding 15 inches? It might have to do with the size of those shad during certain times of year when those fish need it the most to put on that growth. It's just, there's a lot of food availability, but the right size food at the right time of year, I think, is limited. And so that's why they hit that area where they just kind of stop growing. There's just so many mouths to feed at that time of year. Um, but but yeah, I mean, I would, as an angler, I would come to the biologist and say, "What are you talking about? They're not growing. They should be growing because there's so much food in that lake." And not just threadfin and gizzard. We've got tremendous bluegill populations. A variety of different other minnow types that the fish are eating in there. So crayfish, a great crayfish population, long pinchered crayfish. Um, so yeah, there's plenty of food out there for the fish. Yeah.
Well, you're teaching us a lot so far. You're teaching us that Table
Yeah.
Rock Lake, it has a diverse recreational opportunity,
Yeah.
that you guys are doing everything you can to assess age and growth, and work with anglers. We love working with anglers because Bailey and I both feel like that's the key to long-term success for fisheries managers and angler groups, is to collaborate.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned earlier habitat, and I do want to incorporate habitat into this conversation, because I think when you talk about the abundance of forage and the abundance of spotted bass and their slow growth, that habitat plays a big key in that. And we haven't really dove into in the show yet how reservoirs age and what happens to the habitat that exists. So if you could take me back to the 50s when Table Rock was built, what was the habitat that was first impounded, and then what has happened to it over time?
Yeah, so a lot of these big White River lakes, and probably a lot of lakes around the country built in the 50s and 60s, were logged before they were filled. And Table Rock actually filled quicker than it was supposed to. So it actually filled before the dam was completed. So they did not get all the timber logged out of it. So there are forests in, 50 to 80 foot of water untouched that are still very intact The problem is much of your habitat that's usable for fish during most of the year, say at your thermocline or above, so 0 to 30 foot is about the range that most fish can use that has oxygen, suitable oxygen throughout the year. A lot of that stuff is rotted away from just sunlight, the rising and falling of the lake elevation, exposing that woody structure to the elements and it rots away. So, yeah, just a lot of the good habitat in the areas the fish are at most of the time just doesn't exist anymore, or it's just some pole timber, it's just not complex. So we as managers have had to go in and start rebuilding some of that, and that's from taking trees from the shoreline or having trees hauled in off site and then taking them out on. We have a big habitat barge, a big 30-foot pontoon boat built by Bass Pro for us. It's got a dump bed on it. It's like a dump truck of load trees on it, take it to where you want it to be and dump it off. And so we've done some extensive fish habitat work on Table Rock since that time. Going back to the 50s and 60s when that lake was first built, you hear people talk about the boom, the big fisheries boom when these lakes were first impounded because of all that habitat and all that food. And then as they age, you start to see some things decreasing, like the spotted bass. So because you're getting fewer and fewer of those resources. So we've been trying to rebuild them. We completed a $4 million habitat project that Bass Pro helped sponsor, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, Corps of Engineers, MDC, all partnered on that from 2007 to 2013. And we put just right around 2,000 fish habitat structures in the lake. And since that time, we've tried to keep those rebuilt, but that's a lot of fish habitat structures to try to maintain. So we kind of got behind it a little bit. So we applied for another grant from Bass Pro Shops. We got a $200,000 grant from Bass Pro Shops a couple of years ago, and we went in and rebuilt about 700 of those brush piles to get them kind of back up to par. Also, along with that, we've been doing some evaluations looking at how long the brush piles we put in the lake last. So we're determining you need to replace those brush piles at least every 10 years, if not sooner. So kind of use that tool for, 2,000 divided by, the number that we need to rebuild every year for work planning. And so we're trying to get in a place where we can maintain these brush piles. We put them in, but you got to maintain them. They just don't last forever. So that's
Right.
where we're.
When you say brush pile, Shane, are we picturing a Christmas tree, or are we picturing like a 30-foot tree and there's 5 of them? Like, what are we talking about?
Right. Brush piles are typically 3 to 5 cedar or hardwood trees. My preference is to take those off of the shoreline, the big bushy cedar trees that nobody wants there anyway. And the Corps of Engineers has been very gracious to let us take some of those off the shoreline in the past, and because they own all the land around the lake. And so we've been able to partner with them. We've also had a lot of trees hauled in off site. So, Branson's a very highly sought after place to live. So we're constantly getting new condos, new resorts, new houses being built. We've worked with people clearing land to get those trees brought to the lake during that first project with Bass Pro. And so, but yeah, 3 to 5 cedar or hardwood trees. We kind of steer away from the Christmas trees just because they don't last as long. We've done some evaluations on those, and you're only getting about 5 years out of those compared to 10 years or longer out of a big cedar or hardwood. So you get more bang for your buck with the bigger trees, as you might expect. Certainly
Yeah,
pine trees can have their place, but it takes a lot of work and a lot more maintenance if you're going to put those in. But they're better than not having anything if that's what anglers have, or managers
of
have.
course, of
Yeah.
course. So you're primarily focusing on the brush piles, but you also have rock structures. I'm sure you do like
Yeah.
big stumps and things like that as well.
We have, yeah, we've contracted with some bigger barges to dump piles of rock and piles of just larger stumps that'll be there for forever.
Hmm.
Just very dense structures. But those, as you might expect, are a lot more expensive, so we don't put as many of those in. But they are permanent, so they don't need to be maintained.
That makes complete sense. One of the things for anglers out there that Shane said that I think is so important is, there's standing timber in 50 to 80 feet Table Rock. And you can find it, you can see it under graphs. But it's from the original impoundment of the reservoir, and it's not decomposing. And the reason it's not decomposing is because there's no oxygen down there. And decomposition needs oxygen to take place. And if there's no oxygen to decompose that tree, there's no oxygen for your fish to breathe. So whenever we start talking about dissolved oxygen in the reservoir and where's all these things occurring, and Shane's saying 30 foot or shallower, that's where the thermocline is. And we've yet to describe a thermocline. So I think if you want to take the first stab at that, Shane, we'll let you describe a thermocline to the anglers.
Yeah, so I mean, the thermocline is basically where the water stratifies by both temperature and oxygen. In the summer months, it sets up about 30 feet in Table Rock. And for all intents and purposes, I think we could say it's about as deep as sunlight penetrates, where photosynthesis can take place and oxygen can be replenished in the water, dissolved oxygen. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Table Rock, like I said, we have very clear water, so the thermocline sets up deeper. But yeah, during most of the summer months, there is no oxygen below 30 foot. And so it's very difficult for fish to utilize any of that other habitat. But they do, when the thermocline dissipates in the fall or the winter, and they can use that whole lake column. Table Rock's almost 200 foot deep. And I have heard anglers telling me they're catching fish in those, 80, 100 foot of water in the winter when they can actually utilize that habitat again. You'll see the shad go down there in 80 to 100 foot and the fish are following them, and so had a lot of anglers saying, why fishing so hard in the winter? Well, it's because instead of being 30 foot, 0 to 30 foot, now the fish can be 0 to 200 foot. And so they're more spread out. They have more habitat. They're harder to target and catch.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Bailey, what do you think? Are you loving this or what? Table Rock Lake is an amazing place, and Shane is doing a ton of great work.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're an angler listening to this, you haven't fished Table Rock like myself, and you just hear simply just off the density you talked about earlier in the show, I think I don't know why you wouldn't put it on a destination. Then you're hearing voices like Shane that are working to try to make this amount of fish even bigger. I don't know why you wouldn't put Table Rock on one of your destinations to go fish, but it's cool to see, especially if you're an angler that you don't tune into stuff like this and you don't try to maybe pay attention to small details of what's actually going on with your state agencies. I think this is awesome to discuss and bring about because there's a lot more going on, I think, that anglers realize within their fisheries. Like when you're talking about doing the electroshocking at night, obviously it's less visible to the public that that's what you're going out and doing. So I think it's cool, one, to learn about it, but also two, I think it's great that we're kind of bringing more of this stuff to light and showing that you guys are really working hard at creating some of the best fisheries. So, and obviously in listening to the anglers, that's a big thing too. We, all of the anglers in that community, love to hear that.
Yeah.
So it's great.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, because we kind of go out under the cover of darkness, a lot of folks don't know what we do. I think that a lot of our data is just collected from talking to anglers, which it is, some of it, but we're also out there a lot more than folks realize, obtaining that sound data, to base our regulations off of. It isn't just a whim.
Mhm.
It's not just what we thought might be good. It's based on facts and based on data and modeling. So that's how we propose our regulations. And I think a lot of folks don't realize that.
Yeah, and the decisions you guys are going to make is off of calculated decisions based off what you said, data, whereas Tim and Jerry that are disgruntled from their Tuesday night tournaments that they want to see a change.
Yeah.
You can't make a decision based on a couple angry tournament anglers where it needs to be done by actual evidence, that it needs to have a change or it needs to have something in order. It's good to hear that.
And there's
Well, and
very
I think about
powerful.
just
Go ahead.
think about your habitat work, Shane. You're talking about 2,000 sites, 5 to 6 trees per site, replenishing those every 5 to 8 years. So that's 10,000 trees every 5 years that you've got to harvest and move out into the middle of the reservoir. And a tree the size that Shane's talking about is not a 100-pound tree. It's big. It takes the barge. It takes man hours. I mean, It's from harvesting a tree on the shoreline to getting it to the site. What do we average, Shane? How long does it take?
Some of that depends on how far you have to boat the tree, and how big the tree is. And there's
Right.
different methods for how big the tree is. So if it's too big to put on the barge, we might just drag it in the water, and you're not going very fast dragging a big 30-foot tree in the water. So a mile and a half, 2 miles an hour to your site. So if you got to drive a ways, it's going to take a while. But if you can load them up on the deck and take them within, half a mile away, from cutting it down to loading it up to taking it out, 30 minutes, 40 minutes per barge load, and figured 2 or 3 trees on a barge load. It's time consuming, it's labor intensive, um, and there's been a lot of hours put in by MDC staff and volunteers to do this work that I think also anglers don't realize, because we're doing it in the winter. We're out there when it's cold, when there's not a lot of anglers. We're not out there in the summer when everybody's out there and can see us doing it. So it kind of flies under the radar, but it's happening. There's a lot of it going on.
Yeah,
See,
absolutely.
here in New York, we're not allowed to plant any of the brush piles or trees or nothing. But I would happily devote man hours to a volunteer to help put some more trees and things in our lakes up here. If
Sure.
that's what it means to do that. That's
Yeah.
cool. So like random anglers can volunteer to help you guys with stuff like that, or
Yeah,
how does that work?
yeah. We've had a lot of different fishing clubs come out and help us, and but anglers have come out and helped us as well. And sometimes, we'll work with the Corps of Engineers to take out maybe a bunch of cedar trees in one of their parks around the lake, and they've been great to work with on that. They drag them to the shoreline, and we need help just from anglers tying big blocks on them, concrete cinder blocks, so what we use to sink them. And so we just need extra hands for that, and people can volunteer to help with that. And so we've got a lot of great help with that over the years. Just people helping out on shoreline projects like that.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Well, before we move on to Taneycomo, because I do want to talk about it, I think we'd be remiss. We've got a fishery that has smallmouth, spotted bass, and largemouth. And once again, I think it's one of those special places to where, Bailey, if you've never caught all three of those species in one day, you can do it in 1 hour at Table Rock. I think it's worth the challenge. My wife has done it. I've done it. It's one of the places I would go do that. But I think we'd be remiss to not talk about Alabama bass. And you know, the spread of Alabama bass across the country is one thing, at least always in the back of my mind for Table Rock Lake. Because if Alabama bass show up, we take one of the most special, greatest recreational fisheries in the country, and we ruin it. So Shane, what are you guys doing? What is y'all's message about Alabama bass? Are you worried about it?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, we hate them as much as the next biologist, but we have done genetic studies. We've sent genetic samples to the lab and have not come back with any Alabama bass genetics in the spotted bass population. So very happy to report that. We're keeping an eye on it. We'll continue to do genetic sampling, but I guess the message is to anglers, Alabama bass can probably be great in their native range. They can maybe get to those sizes that everybody raves about, and those big 7, 8, 9 pound spotted bass, as you would think of them. But, when you take them outside of that and introduce them into another population, you're just asking for trouble. And they would not do well here. They would not grow to those sizes. They wouldn't, I mean, they'd be, I think, in the same boat as the spotted bass, and we'd see the decline in not only the spotted bass population even further, but probably the largemouth and smallmouth as well. So, yeah, so far so good on that, but we want to keep them away. So definitely, definitely don't introduce fish species where they don't
Yeah.
belong, where they're not native.
Well, Bailey and I did an episode from Lake Norman once, and we were discussing Alabama bass and the process that happens. And, Alabama bass can hybridize with all three of the species you have. And when that hybridization occurs, for some reason, their genetics is just so much stronger, where either just number of fish or strength of heredity. But it seems like the smallmouth bass just disappear within a decade. Spotted bass as well, and then it takes the largemouth a little bit longer, but they they get out of the main body of the water and they just go to the small tributaries, and all of a sudden it's just a fishery full what we would call, stunted Alabama bass, and it is not the way we want to go. So I love hearing that y'all are doing genetic testing and kind of monitoring, and we're going to do more episodes in Alabama bass specifically because I think it's an important topic to discuss. But I love hearing that y'all stance is no Alabama bass.
Absolutely. No Alabama bass. No other bass introductions. Missouri's very proud of their native strains of bass that we have in the state. Northern strain largemouth. They do well here. They do as well as they can based on where they live in the latitude. Or where they live, water temperature wise and condition wise. So we
Right.
grow I mean, I've seen 10-pound plus bass come out of Table Rock. Um,
Right.
I fully believe that the strain of largemouth bass we have in the lake is capable of getting to that. I also fully believe that they see a lot of lures and they see a lot of fishing pressure, and that gets more and more every year. And
Mhm.
um, I think those fish are a lot smarter than we give them credit for. People say there aren't big 10-pound bass in the lake. There are. They're just smart and they know how to avoid being caught and what not to
Mhm.
eat. It's going to cause them pain. Um, that's what I think. And I say that just because, when the Alabama rig the A rigs came out, there was, I think, 5 largemouth over 10 pounds caught that year. And I'd never heard of a 10-pound largemouth. Well, here's a lure that these fish have never seen.
Right.
They're going after. It looks like a school of bait fish. And so, they're there. They're just, I mean, Table Rock gets so much fishing pressure at any given day of the week, at any given time of the year. You go out on a Wednesday in the summer and every point's got a boat on it. And you're thinking, man, it's fish just don't ever get a break.
That's
So
my favorite part about Table Rig. There is a boat on every point, and every one of them is catching fish.
they
There's
are.
nobody that's
Everyone's
like, I
catching
zeroed today.
fish. Yeah. But I certainly think after you catch a fish 4 or 5 times, it's going to learn to probably start avoiding those lures a little more. um,
Well, and you're, I mean, I hope I'm not outing you, but you're a pretty big angler yourself. I mean, there's
yeah.
often that I text you and it's, well, I'm on the water right now. And you don't mean I'm on the water working, you mean I'm on the water fishing.
Got to take advantage of those resources.
There you go, brother.
Yeah. So you're sampling. That's all.
Exactly. How can I tell anglers what to use if I don't go out and test it myself?
That's right.
Which,
That's
in all
awesome.
reality, I think part of being a biologist, you really do need to have a handle on that because, yeah, I mean, I get calls every day. Where can I go? Where can I go to catch this? What can I use? I mean, you've got to have at least an understanding of how to go catch those fish, to be able to point people in the right direction. And not only do I just love it because it's my passion, but um, yeah, I mean, I think it's important for managers to get out and fish their waters. I really do because you have to know that.
Mm.
There's the lesson of the day, Bailey, is if you're going to be a fisheries manager, go test the water. And by the way, if you're an angler and you're questioning, is my biologist an angler? Your biologist is an angler as well. They're out
More
fishing.
than likely. More than likely, they're an angler. Yeah,
Yeah.
because we do this because we love it, because we have a passion for it. Yeah, so we're wanting to catch them as much as possible too.
All
Love
right,
that.
now tell me about Taneycomo. I know in 2019, I show up at Table Rock. I know Table Rock. I'm super excited to be there. And then you start telling me about a lake called Taneycomo that I've never heard of. So let's hear the story of your other fishery.
Yeah, Lake Taneycomo, it basically starts at the tailwater of Table Rock, so at the bottom of the dam. It was first built in 1913, so 22 miles down from Table Rock Dam is another dam that was a lower dam that was built in 1913. It is our state's oldest hydroelectric reservoir. It's run by Liberty Utilities, who are great to work with, great partners. Can't say enough good about those guys. But the upper end of the lake is cold because of the water feeding it from 140 feet deep in Table Rock Lake. So, because it stays cold year round, we decided it'd be a good idea to stock some trout for a fishery there. And so, shortly after Table Rock Dam was built in 1959, we introduced rainbow trout, and We maintain those stockings through stockings from our fish hatchery, but also from Neosho National Fish Hatchery. They also stock some of the rainbow trout every year for us. So we stock about 560,000 rainbow trout into the lake every year. So it's the numbers are high, densities of fish are good. And we also stock brown trout. We introduced brown trout in the 80s, a lower density stocking. So we only stock about 15,000 of those a year. But because they're lower density, they also grow very fast and very big, which we can talk about here in a minute. Some of the record brown trout that have been pulled out of Lake Taneycomo. But overall, there's been so much management take place, and I'm kind of riding on the heels of the people that went before me, so to speak. I mean, they saw this fishery, they managed this fishery through stocking rates that would maintain quality. In the mid 80s, they had some issues with stocking too many fish and seeing a big decrease in the number of bigger fish in the population. So at one time, we were stocking 1.6 million rainbow trout in the lake. After realizing that was starting to do more damage than good, kind of going back to the more fish you have, the more competition for food, the less those fish are going to grow. We reduced that stocking to 700,000 and started to see great increases in the number of fish back in the lake. And we also imposed a slot limit on the rainbow trout in the upper 3 miles of the lake. So rainbow trout from 12 to 20 inches have to be released, which allows for those fish longer growing time. Before that, it was anglers just ripping them right out, as stocked fish. They didn't have any kind of retention time. So we've seen that regulation take off and do tremendous wonders for that fishery. I mean, we have good numbers of rainbow trout from 12 to 20 inches. You can go out in the trophy area and catch a 16, 17-inch rainbow. It's not that hard. It's flies and artificial lures only up there. So even more protection on those bigger fish to be able to be caught and released safely. It's a tremendous trout fishery. It's our state's largest trout fishery, and it's primarily maintained just through intensive management and stocking from MDC. On the lower end of the lake, going back down towards the bottom dam, 22 miles away, we have a tremendous largemouth bass fishery still. Lake Taneycomo was a warm water fishery before Table Rock was built, so crappie, largemouth, bluegill, red ear sunfish, they're all still in there. So where it stays warmer, further away from Table Rock Dam, those other warm water species do very well down there. So we have a very, very good largemouth bass fishery in the lower end of the lake. So it's kind of got it all. It's a different system than Table Rock. It's because it's older, it's more riverine. Um, you know, Mainly based on its age and siltation over time. It's much more shallow. We've got a lot more aquatic vegetation that we've been kind of battling with on the lower end of the lake, trying to find some solutions for long-term control of that right now. But vegetation's great for fish. And so, the bass and the sunfish populations do great down there because of it. So,
Yeah. So once again, a couple things to
so
unpack there. You say it's cold? What temperature are we talking? 140 degree or 140 feet deep out of Table Rock. What is that water coming out of Table Rock as?
let's average about 50 degrees year round, give or take. Maybe it gets in the 40s on a real cold winter, or maybe up to 60 on a really hot year, so averaging around 50. So optimal conditions for trout.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the water just as it goes down that 22 miles, how warm does it get on the other end
The
at the
surface
bottom?
temps get up in the 70s, maybe pushing 80 in spots, but that's just the surface temp. If you go 4 or 5 feet down, it's still pretty cold just for the way that
Yeah.
water's released from the bottom of Table Rock. And so trout still survive down there, but we can't stock down there in the summer because of those warm surface temperatures. So we just have to rely on what swims down there or what we've stocked there in the winter to maintain the trout fishery down there.
And I suspect the ones that swim down there, if they're small, they become food for the largemouth pretty quick.
That's probably a good guess. Yeah. That's probably why we have a tremendous largemouth bass fishery down there.
So like 8 to 12-inch trout colored swim bait, Bailey, on Taneycomo on the grass line. It's
Yeah.
gotta be pretty good.
Yeah.
You're making the swim baiters go crazy now, saying stuff like that.
I'm probably making the local anglers mad because I don't like to talk about how good it really is. But
Well, that's what I look. I
Sorry.
never heard of Taneycomo, so I'm putting it on blast.
Yeah, you're gonna start seeing some out-of-state license plates now.
yeah,
That might help
But
you
wait,
with the fishing pressure on Table Rock.
well, you haven't even heard the best part about Taneycomo. So tell me about the brown trout. Like, what is the lake record for Taneycomo for brown trout?
yeah. So we've been toying around with some triploid brown trout in Lake Taneycomo because none of the trout. Well, I take that back. Some of the rainbow trout in the lake do reproduce, but not enough to maintain the amount of fishing pressure we have. So we stock most all the brown trout are stocked. So we started toying around with some triploid brown trout, which are basically just brown trout eggs. At the egg level, we shock those eggs to make them sterile. So either heat or pressure shocked makes them sterile, makes them unable to reproduce. And so instead of putting energy towards reproduction, which they're not going to accomplish in that system anyway, they put all that energy towards growth. So they're not making eggs, they're not trying to put that energy there. And so in 2009, an angler caught a 28-pound brown trout that was a diploid, which is your standard reproducing brown trout, or able to reproduce. In 2019, an angler caught a 36-pound brown trout that was one of our triploids. And we released that fish was released back into the water, so we weren't able to really get any age data on it. But just 6 months later, in September 2019, an angler caught a 40-pound brown trout that was also a triploid. So that one didn't make it, unfortunately, but we were able to pull its otolith, which is that ear bone's got the growth rings on it, and that fish was 8 years old. So we grew a 40-pound brown trout in just 8 years. So
Holy crap!
the triploidity component really helped that fish add, energy, put all its energy to growth, and just reach tremendous size. I think the world record's 44 pounds, so we're not too shy of that. So we stocked those from 2013 to 2015, and then we kind of monitored that over time. And then, like I said, 2019, those were caught. So we started stocking triploids again in 2020 or 2021. And we're going to continue to stock triploids along with our normal brown trout commitment every year in the foreseeable future because that was such a successful program.
So what I hear you say is 2028 world record is coming home to Missouri. Taneycomo.
I mean, all the ingredients are there to grow fish, grow big fish. They've got 30, 40 foot of water, deep water refuge down lower in the lake, just all the small rainbow trout they want to eat when they get that big,
Yeah.
tremendous sculpin population in the lake. I mean, tons and tons of food for those fish to grow big. So, yeah.
So a
Thanksgiving
20-pound
every
brown
day.
trout. Yeah, Thanksgiving every day. You're right, Bailey. But a 20-pound brown trout is eating rainbow trout, the stalker rainbow trout.
Yeah, I mean, they're probably eating some of the stalkers when they get that big. Yeah. Yeah.
So once again, swim bait anglers.
Yeah,
Yeah. It's a rainbow trout colored swim bait is pretty effective for both big brown trout and largemouth. Yeah.
that's awesome.
And Bailey's a kayak angler. So tell me there's kayak launch on Taneycomo.
Oh yeah. There's a lot of kayak fishing out there for sure. Um, tons of people like to canoe and kayak that. There's outfitters that'll drop you in at one part of the lake and pick you up at another as you go downstream. So it's very popular for that kind of fishing.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, Shane has the best recreational fishery in the country. You just heard he's got a world-class trout fishery, and there's a little bit of a chance that Taneycomo with the trout stocking and the largemouth, there's a chance that there might be some pretty gigantic largemouth in the bottom of Taneycomo as well.
Yeah, the biggest one I've seen shocking in Missouri came up a couple of years ago, but we were unable to net it. It was one of those deals that your field of your electrofishing boat's only so big. So if it comes up on the outside of the field, they'll get stunned or, hit, but not stunned. And saw that thing come up and swim away. And I mean, I swear it could swallow a basketball. It was just like, it was the biggest largemouth I'd ever seen. And you watch it swim off.
Like state record size?
I don't know if state record size. It happened so fast, but I could tell you it had the biggest head of any largemouth I've seen. And it's not uncommon. I mean, when we go shock there in the spring, it's not uncommon to get 3, 4, 5 pound largemouth regularly. Um, we talk about PSDs, when we're talking about our fish data, and that's proportional stock density or the number of fish over a certain size in the sample, right? So like PSD of 15, the number of fish over your 15-inch minimum length limit, and largemouth in Table Rock typically runs 20 to 30%. Yeah, 25 to 35% in the spring. In Lake Taneycomo on the largemouth bass, the PSD of 15 is like 50 to 70%. So, just a good numbers of high quality bass down there. It's a
So
fun lake shock.
what you're saying to me, Shane, is I can go to Branson, get a hotel, go out and catch a lot of fish on Table Rock, and then spend the day on Taneycomo and, and catch some quality fish and maybe a big brown trout as well. So you're telling me Branson is a destination for all anglers?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, people come from a lot of different areas to fish down here, because of the resources we have. And again, why this boy from Blue Springs did not end up moving back to Blue Springs. I mean, how can you leave resources
I
like
get
that
it.
as a fisherman? I mean, it's just everything that you could want. And not far from Lake Taneycomo, downstream further, is Bull Shoals Lake, which is another tremendous reservoir that MDC manages. Well, Arkansas Game and Fish manages the portions in Arkansas, and they do a tremendous job. It's a world class bass and crappie fishery as well. So it's all here. It's all right here. Yeah.
It's all right
Shoot,
there.
I might be adding Missouri to my retirement state list. Between that and what you're selling me right now, and the deer hunting you guys have in Missouri,
Yeah.
oh
Yeah.
man, that sounds like a great place to go retire for any outdoorsman.
Yeah, Missouri's got a lot of neat resources. You go in northern part of Missouri, it's more Loess Hills and plains and prairies and big deer. But southern part of the state is more clear water streams, smallmouth bass streams. We didn't even touch on those, but all the tributaries that feed Bull Shoals and Table Rock and Taneycomo are just crystal clear, floatable smallmouth bass fisheries, and rock bass fisheries that, if you're a floater, that's a high destination, just tremendous smallmouth bass fisheries in those areas. So, yeah.
Probably couldn't wear this Eagles hoodie there, but we'll get it.
I'd give it a month or two at least. Yeah. The wound's still pretty
Not
fresh.
anytime soon.
Yeah. Wound's still pretty fresh. It's pretty quiet around here today.
Yeah. I've been trying to hold back my remarks for you, Shane.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
All right, let me see here. Shane, you talked a little bit about forward-facing sonar and how it's going to potentially impact some of the fish in Table Rock. But I want to know, how are you using it as a scientist? Are you using forward-facing sonar, and if so, what are you doing with it?
Yeah, yeah, because the technology is there, we really have been utilizing that. I talked a little bit about us evaluating our brush piles that we put in the lake. We've been using forward-facing sonar to evaluate fish use of the different years of brush piles that we've put in. So, because we've done so much habitat work at Table Rock, we've got a really unique data set of 15 different years of brush piles that we can look at, and so we've been going out actually using it to count the number of fish using each of these habitat structures of different years and different type. And so we can hopefully then determine at what age does fish usage of a brush pile slow? Or, at what point does 50% of the fish stop using it, and kind of help define how often we need to rebuild those brush piles, not only based on what we already know about their rates of decomposition, which we used down imaging sonar to evaluate that, and side imaging. But with forward facing, we can see just how many fish are using all these things that we put in. So it's been a tremendous tool for that. So it certainly has applications in the biological.
Well, what breaks some news for us? Whenever we're assessing these, like, what year is it that fish stop using them as frequent?
To be determined. So we're kind of in the middle of that project right now. We haven't got all that data crunched yet. Um, I can tell you just from the pine tree structures we've looked at, and that was all through scuba diving. And because our lake's clear, we could see really well. So years ago, me and another biologist spent a lot of time scuba diving all the different habitat structure types. That's how we know pine trees only last about 5, 6 years. Uh, but I can tell you, a 5-year-old pine tree structure doesn't have any fish on it. So we're trying to get at some of those numbers. As you might expect, the older it gets, the less fish start to use it. More of the complexity of that structure starts to deteriorate, the less those fish are going to start using it as much. I mean, they'll still use it, but not to the degree that they would a new one, if that makes
Gotcha.
sense. So we don't have any hard, fast numbers, but I can tell you just looking at, some 10 to 12-year-old brush piles, there's still some fish around it, but nowhere near the number of fish that's around a 2-year-old brush pile. So,
Makes sense. And
yep.
you also use the AquaView Quad, right? AquaView
Yeah,
Vantage.
yeah. So um, before we used to scuba dive. Well, now we have tools like forward-facing sonar and aquaviews. So we use AquaView Quad, drop it down in the middle of a brush pile. We can see a 360-degree view of what's happening around that brush pile, so we can see what species are using the pile. Combine that with the forward-facing sonar technology and maybe get at, here's what the number of fish that were using it and here's what species they were. And see if we can maybe tease out how fish species use different types of habitat. We did a little bit of that when we did the scuba diving. So we evaluated bass and crappie use of cedar and hardwood trees, and did show that largemouth bass had a preference for the hardwood trees versus the cedar trees. And conversely, the crappie preferred the cedar trees over the hardwood trees. Even though both species utilized both habitat types, they did show preferences. So that's kind of what we'd like to get at with the AquaView technology that's available to us
Right.
now.
Now, as an angler, how do I know? Um, is there a way that I can learn where the habitat are, what types they are, when they were put there? Because you've given me some information. If I
Yeah.
was targeting largemouth, I'd like a hardwood, and I'd like it younger than 5 years. Same thing for crappie, but is there a way to learn where they're at on Table Rock?
Yeah. MDC does a really good job of posting all that on our website. So they can just go to the Department of Conservation's webpage, mdc.mo.gov, go to the fishing section and click on where to fish. And we've got a great interactive map that shows all of the brush piles, all the habitat structures we've put in all of our lakes in Missouri. So you can use that. You can download specific lakes. So like all 2,000 structures in Table Rock, you can download to an SD card, plug it right into your GPS unit on your boat, and navigate right to those. And then we've also developed an app. It's called the Mo Fishing app. That's a free download that uses your phone's GPS. So you look at where you're at on the lake. It shows you the habitat structures, and you use your phone's GPS will tell you where you're at, and you can navigate to the structures that way. So try to make it as easy as possible for folks to get out and utilize these structures that we're putting in.
Yeah, Bailey's can make it even easier because for anybody who's listening to the show, right, Bailey, look at the show description and there's going to be the link for some of that stuff. I promise you.
That's
He's a
right.
wizard with it.
I don't know about wizard, but we'll try to make it as easy as possible.
Love it, love it. The other thing you mentioned is that you're thinking about doing a regulation change on spotted bass for Table Rock, and I would love to walk through that process. You have assessed the fishery, you've looked at age, you've determined that it's got to be lower. So, what are the next steps specifically within the state of Missouri? How does a regulation change happen, and how do anglers participate, or do they?
Yep. Yep. Yes to all the above. So, it starts with collecting the data. We put all that data together. We run it through our working groups that we have in the agency. We've got a reservoir working group, that's comprised of biologists that manage reservoirs throughout the state. So getting a lot of different minds looking at this data, being very clear that this is what this data is telling us, and everybody in agreement that this is how we need to proceed moving forward. We do that, present that to our administration, and get their blessing, if you will, or just here's what the data says, here's how we need to proceed. And then kind of brings us to the step we're at now. We're developing a communication plan. We're going to have a website that's going to have all this information we're talking about. It'll help anglers understand, what we're seeing as biologists, have the graphs on there showing you the number of fish that are increasing and the size is decreasing. Here's what the growth is. Here's the ages. All that information, be very public facing. And then anglers will have an opportunity to comment on this regulation change. So there'll be a 45-day comment period that'll be opening here probably by the end of the month. They'll be able to voice their concerns, support or not support. And then we take all that into consideration before we move to the final step, which is implementing that regulation change. And so if approved, if everything says that we need to move forward with this, we'd likely be looking at 2026 for implementation of this. Yeah.
All right, so 2026, it becomes a reg. Then I think the final step is to actually participate and harvest some fish between 12 and 15 inches. Let's thin that population down a little bit and improve the spotted bass and table rock.
Yeah. Yep. And so to follow up on evaluation, we will conduct another creel survey, 4 or 5 years post regulation change, see if anglers are harvesting more, and hopefully, fingers crossed that we start to see those reverse trends in our electrofishing data, start seeing the size of fish start increasing more. But it takes angler participation, and we've gone so far down the rabbit hole of don't keep bass, but there's certain instances where that really does need to take place. And I'm not saying everywhere, but I will say this with confidence in talking about Table Rock. There's a lot more spotted bass in that lake than there are crappie, but everybody that catches crappie keeps a limit of 15 crappie a day. So, why not shift some of that harvest towards a species that really needs to be harvested more? 12-inch spotted bass are delicious. I'll just say it. I mean, they're great to eat. So
I'm going to actually caveat that. In theory, 12-inch spotted bass are delicious. The recommendation right now, regulation is 15 inches, so Shane has no idea.
Well, there's other lakes that have 12-inch, and that's the kind of some more ammunition for this regulation change. Every other lake in Missouri is 12 inches for spotted bass. So Table Rock's kind of the last man standing on that front, simply because it's one of the few lakes in the state that does consistently produce 15-inch spotted bass. We just aren't seeing the numbers of spotted bass that big produced that we used to. They do still get there, though. So it's just a product of the resources they have available to them.
Yeah.
But yeah.
What do you got, Bailey?
It's cool to see the general angler isn't going to be, if they don't hear this conversation of the scientific reasons of why a fisheries, like a spotted bass might be getting on average smaller. They'll just be sitting back like, oh, it's so hard to catch a big one anymore. It's all because of this dang technology. It's all because the fishing pressure, or they don't actually, think about some of these variables like that you guys and your team are actually looking at on a daily basis. So it's awesome to take the old traditional fisherman theory and debunk it, because it can basically be debunked just about every single time, because obviously anglers like myself are passionate. We like to think that we're right in our theories, where there's a lot of things we don't think about because we don't have a degree in studying what's actually going on in that ecosystem. So it's kind of cool to see all that being done. And like I said earlier, and seeing that you guys are making changes for the better of the fishery driven by data that you've accrued years over years, versus just a couple of anglers that are mad because they're not catching bigger fish on a fishery. So it's cool to see all that. And I'll be excited to circle back on this, in a couple of years with you, and just see once that change is implemented, to see is it starting to work yet? If you've seen changes, how fast do you see the changes once you do implement that size or the size difference? It'll be really cool to see.
Yeah, for sure. And I know anglers that can consistently catch 15-inch spotted bass. Anglers that have fished this lake for a lot of years that know where those fish hang out, because they are hanging out generally in different areas that the smaller ones are. Probably relating back to what we talked about with food. Maybe the food that they're eating is slightly different than the smaller spotted bass. So they're just in these deep offshore areas, that most anglers aren't fishing. So what we need is anglers to be able to that can catch 12-inch spotted bass consistently. We need an avenue for them to be able to harvest some fish. So this is a way to do that.
You guys
Makes
just need to start
sense.
handing out cookbooks at the ramp for these guys for 12-inch, 15-inch spotted bass. That's what you should do. You should just set up shop, have a little tailgate, on the weekends, and start just, tell them to bring in some spots, and you'll cook them up for them. A little party for the anglers.
Might change some people's minds, especially, yeah, they're pretty good to eat.
Well, we've seen that work with Alabama bass. We've seen agencies partner with, especially local tournament organizations, to have some harvest style events and fillet those fish on the shoreline, and have a fish fry following the tournament. And they do things like the most fish, smallest fish, all those different prizes for different parts to participate. And I don't think it's out of question, Bailey, that you're going to see more agencies discussing harvest, especially we see this trend across the country. Catch and release has went a little too far. We're not getting the participation. We have some anglers who could really, especially with forward-facing sonar, could really help us right now. And you see these conversations happening. You see states like Oklahoma that are making the regulation allow for more harvest. You see the same thing in Florida. It's going to keep happening, and it's really cool that Shane brought us some information about the spotted bass. I think if you look at it, takes 10 years to get to 15 inches, but that's basically their lifespan, and that really limits the harvest of those fish, and it's pulling out the ones that can exceed 15 inches faster, and those are the ones we really probably want to protect.
Right. And I really, I don't see lowering it to 12 inches as a way to decrease the number of 15-inch spotted bass in the population. I mean, and as a biologist, I mean, that's just not the way it works. People aren't going to specifically target those bigger ones. It's getting those slow growers out of the population. Those big ones are still going to continue to hit 15.
Yeah, I love it. And Shane has said a couple things that I think we want to tell our audience again. If you want to participate, they take volunteers for electrofishing. They take volunteers for putting out habitat. They do the krill surveys. Whenever you see them talking to other anglers, like stop and participate in the krill survey. They're going to have a public comment phase. I'd love for our listeners to be the educated listeners that go in and support the change in the regulation. Like, those things would be huge to help specifically Table Rock. But these things are happening on every water body across the country in some way. So find your local biologist and participate.
Yeah, we all, like I said at the beginning, we all want the same things. I've always been a very strong proponent throughout my career is we need to be managing for what the anglers want to happen, right? I mean, otherwise, kind of why are we doing it? So let's work together to make these things happen. And I feel like we've been able to do that, especially on Taneycomo. Tremendous angler base there that's helped us implement and spread the word of catch and release on larger trout. And it's just let's all work together to get it done. Your biologists are waiting for your call. I think if you're willing to, cooperate. When we did all this habitat, we had guides, we had anglers, we had focus group meetings. It's like, tell us where you guys want to see these things. Where are the best places? Because, I mean, anglers, I'll admit it, they know more about fishing Table Rock Lake than I do. I mean, I'll admit it up front. So let's utilize that knowledge. Where's the best places we can put habitat structures? Where's the best places I can catch the most bass electrofishing? Let's work together on that. So.
Yeah, and it's not like you're going to go out there and put it live on the internet for everybody. Like, hey, this is where they're catching the most fish. Like, giving up their spot. Like, you guys aren't there to blow up their waypoints. It's there to better the fishery. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know there's some anglers. Speaking personally, I know there's some here in New York that don't like to to talk to some of the DEC who is here in New York, because they don't want to like give anything away. They're afraid of any sort of information to give away to the public, which is the last thing I feel like you guys have any interest in doing.
Right. Right. Yeah. No, I could see a little hesitation on, some of those focus group meetings. They wouldn't give us their best spots, right? Like they don't want a brush
Mhm.
pile put there and then everybody going and fishing it. But it's like in general, would points be better? Would bluff ends be better? Would gravel flats be better? Because I mean, again, they're the ones out there fishing 300 days a year. They know more about the lake than I do on that front. So, um,
Mhm.
I always tell people I can tell you from a biological component what's happening, but the anglers are a better resource for what's really happening fish behavior wise, and where they're going
Yeah.
certain times of the year. And um, yeah, so
Awesome. Yeah.
Well,
Steve, you
one
got
last
anything
thing
else?
I've got. Yeah, I want to talk about tournaments for a second. Do y'all are y'all quantifying how many tournaments are happening in on Table Rock or Taneycomo? I don't know. Maybe they're doing tournaments on Taneycomo, and our participation, like from youth groups, high schools, colleges, local events, like are those trends improving, decreasing? What are we seeing?
so MDC doesn't really monitor that. We don't have a method in place for tracking the number of tournaments, just the regatta permits, that the tournament organizers have to get. So I don't have an answer for what the trends are. Um, I could tell you just observationally, I would say it's on the rise. There's no doubt that there's more fishermen here than in 2007 when I got down to Branson. There's more bass fishermen in any given day. There's more tournaments happening on any given Saturday. But we just don't keep records of that within our agency. So,
All right, that makes sense. I know that you and I have had offline discussions all the time about Table Rock Lake and tournaments, and I do hope Major League Fishing comes back soon because it's always fun to spend time with you. We see each other at conferences all the time, but it's fun to spend time at your home body of water. And I'm sure that whatever data we have, we'll continue to share with you guys and make it available because we want to be part of this conversation.
yeah, it's been great. It's been great.
Awesome. Steve, you got anything else for him?
No, sir. I'm great, Shane. You over delivered as I expected you would. Once again, Shane's one of those biologists that are my favorites. Favorite to work with, love to listen to and learn from. There's so much to learn from this episode. I'm gonna have to re-listen to it again. And Shane's doing that cutting edge research. Whether it's with the barge and putting out habitat, that was cutting edge at the time. Now using forward-facing sonar and aquaview to assess habitat, that's cutting edge. Understanding what's happening in the population and looking at how long does it take a fish to get to a certain size class, and using that as part of regulation. These are the things that good fishery scientists are doing, and I knew I needed Shane to be the person that showed the world, um, how we do it.
Yeah. Well, I've been fortunate and blessed and proud to be part of an agency that's always stood on scientific principles, right? Like biological data. It isn't, again, not our opinion. Here's what needs to happen. This is based on facts, and so um, the great thing about biological data, as I'm sure you'd agree, is that it's not always popular. It maybe isn't what everybody wants to see, but at the end of the day, I can sleep at night knowing that this is the best decision for the lake based on what the data and what the modeling shows us, and there's countless examples over the years. The slot limit on Lake Taneycomo, that was not popular when we implemented. I'm here to tell you when it was implemented. But fast forward 10 years and they say, that's the greatest thing you ever did. Well, yeah, it is because it was based on data, right? I mean, it was based on facts. So you can stand behind that and you can put your stamp on it and not worry that at the end of the day, the population is going to crash because you made a bad decision. So that's how I feel about it, and I'm glad that our agency supports that and stands behind their biologists that make those decisions. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, I have a good feeling about it. I think we're in a really good place to make some changes and educate anglers that, hey, this wasn't just something I came up with last night. This is based on a lot of years of data. And, when I've talked to anglers about this, many of them are seeing the same trends, and they say, well, now that you mention it, I am starting to catch fewer large spotted bass. So when you really put it in front of them, it's like, yeah, I can't really argue that, that is what's happening. And so just know that we're out here for the anglers. We're not trying to do something shady. We're out here trying to make the resources the best they can be, and we do that with the data. So
Yeah.
Well, Shane, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, for your friendship over the last several years. Just getting to know you's been a wonderful experience in my life. I'm so glad we got to introduce the audience to you. I look forward to seeing what happens next on Table Rock, and more than anything, you're just one of those superstar biologists that everybody needs to know. Best in class across the country. So hopefully your phone's not ringing off the hook, but I'm sure that there's going to be several people who want to have you on their podcast and talk Table Rock. I know whenever MLF has an event, we're going to be coming right back to you to discuss that in detail. I'm sure Bailey is going to have you on other episodes. So thank you so much for spending time with us today.
yeah, no, it's been a pleasure, and it's been a pleasure to get to know you and work with you on the MLF side of things, and just bouncing ideas from biologist to biologist is super valuable too. So appreciate that. But yeah, I mean, that's appreciate the kind words, and I'm blessed to be able to call this a career. I tell a lot of students that talk to a lot of college groups, a lot of student groups, you're not going to get rich in this field. You're not going to make tons of money, but there's not been a day I don't look forward to going to work. And, if you can say that, then it's been a pretty fulfilling career, pretty fulfilling life. So, we're very lucky to be able to stand on the heels of those that went before me and it's a story that I like telling, and I'm not trying to take all the credit for it. It's like everybody has put work into this, and I love telling the story of how it came to be and how it got to be so great. So just need to be a part of. So thanks for having me on to talk about it.
Yeah, man.
Of course.
Appreciate your time. All right, folks, and that is going to do it for today's show with Mr. Shane Bush. Like we said in the intro, this might be one that you want to run back because there was a lot of great information. Steve, I believe at one point you said even you yourself might run this back and review some of the stuff that Shane dropped.
I love these episodes because I still learn. It's not necessarily that Shane is teaching me a new fisheries technique, but what he's doing is, in my position with Major League Fishing, in my social media, I get questions about all kinds of reservoirs and water bodies across the U.S. And understanding what's happening at each one of them is a difficult task. And so, to get somebody like Shane sit down with us for an hour, hour and a half. It's an unbelievable resource. I can't thank him enough. But I'm going to listen to it again because I want to learn more. Specifically, I love the story about Taneycomo. I think that's really cool. But the things he's talking about habitat, crappie versus largemouth, how long it takes to grow fish to a certain size, like I just got to get my facts, and I gotta have those for the database. So when people ask me about Table Rock, I remember what Shane told me.
Heck yeah. There was a lot of great nuggets in there. So make sure you guys, if you've made it through to this point in the episode, one, thank you so much for that. And I guess that brings us to a fun part of each and every show, and that is the Lake Hotline. So for folks that if this is your first real biology, Lake Hotline is essentially where you guys, whether you're watching, listening to the show, can get your questions answered on the show by yours truly, Mr. Steve Barden here. And so you can submit that through, via social media. You can submit through email, whatever that may be. That information's down below in the show notes. But make sure to submit your questions, and we'll get them up here on the show. And that is today's Lake Hotline question for you, Steve, is from Chris Coleman, who emailed in and said, he asked, what is the top end size of a pure northern strain largemouth bass? That's the first part of the question.
Okay, so first part of the question, what is the top end size of pure northern? We probably need to caveat that with, over the years, we've learned how to assess genetic material, and we've got different techniques. And what that has led to is the American Fisheries Society actually approving the split of largemouth bass into at least two species, currently two species as we sit in 2025. So that would be northern largemouth bass, which we now just call largemouth bass. And the other species is Florida bass, which we used to call Florida largemouth bass. So what Chris's question is basically that largemouth bass that occurred in the northeastern part of the United States, as well as down south towards the states of Oklahoma and Texas historically. What is the top end growth of that fish? So if we look at some of the state records before Florida was transported into states like Texas, we know that those fish grew to 12 to 13 pounds. As Florida bass were introduced into those states, then the records were shattered. And they would exceed that by 4 or 5, even maybe 6 pounds. As we look at the northern states, we're pretty sure that most of the state records, at least the state records before the 50s, were northern or largemouth bass, and that would be anywhere from 10 to 14 pounds, depending on which state you're looking at. So the top end growth, I would say, is somewhere in that 13 to 14 pound range.
So were there a lot of fish transplanted, like from south to north, or?
Well, we don't know that to be fact. Now, if you think about the fact that the largemouth bass occurred in about 20 states in the U.S. and nothing west of the Rocky Mountains, but now we see largemouth in those states. Well, how did they get there? They got there through either purposeful or accidental stocking. And there was a time at the creation of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the head of U.S. Fish and Wildlife was Spencer Fullerton Baird. And Spencer, his idea was to transport sport fish across the U.S. Now, at that time, he was using common carp and German trout, which we call brown trout. Both of those are non-native species. And so you question, like, how do fish get transported? Well, look at something like a common carp that wasn't native to North America at all, but now we can find in every single water body across the country. That happened because they would put them in fish cars on rails, and they would literally, every time they went over a bridge, they would dump common carp and German trout out, and they would just hope that they survived. And that worked well enough to make that a species that most now considered naturalized, as in it's not an invasive species and a non-native invasive. Instead, it's just something that we have to deal with, common carp. And you even heard in this episode, Shane was talking about German trout, but he was using brown trout because that's what we call them now, and whenever we stock them. So, there's some of these species that they got transported purposefully. Others that they hit those bodies of water and then they traveled, through tributaries and the watershed, and they just expanded their introduced range. So it's not impossible that an angler might be fishing in the state of Florida and then have a weekend trip and then drive back north, and it is not impossible that they could keep that fish alive for 2 or 3 days and then transplant it to a water body in the north. And because that's not impossible, then it's also not impossible that same angler couldn't claim that they caught that fish from a local water body. And then we have a state record that maybe exceeds that 13 to 14 pounds that is questionable. The hard part, Bailey, is without genetic sample or photographic evidence, you really can't tell the difference between a Florida and a largemouth bass or northern largemouth bass. There's not many markers on the exterior of that fish that tells you which species it is. So some of these records we may never know. Now, you've probably heard on podcasts like Bass After Dark that myself, Josh Sackmore, and some biologists from Florida, we actually took a fin sample from the skin mount of Carita's trophy world record bass that was being held in Georgia. We took a fin sample on that, and they ran genetics, and they're able to tell us that Carita's fish was a pure Florida. There's not a world where maybe some of these state records, they do exist as a skin mount, and we could go in and collect a sample of that, a fin sample, and we could run that genetic, and we could learn what type of genetic material it has, which would tell us if it's a northern bass or a Florida. To learn where it came from is more difficult. There is some isotope analysis that can be done that would tell us where that fish grew up, but it's going to cost several $100,000 or more to actually look at an individual like that. But we can look at the types of isotopes that are in its hard structures, like its spines or like its bones, and we could see what that fish is made of, which would tell us which part of the country it came from. Nobody's ever going to do that because it's just not worth. There's no value in it. But to understand how big those fish are and are they transported, those are the things that we'd have to do.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, granted, they didn't likely have like the live well type of equipment back then. Prior to how well we're able to, I guess, restrict people from transplanting fish nowadays. But I'd imagine it'd be kind of almost Wild Westish back in the day of people trying to move fish
Yeah.
around when there wasn't as much restrictions and rules, and especially the
Absolutely.
knowledge on what that could impact a fishery by moving fish around, or even moving vegetation around, how much that could damage or improve fishery. But it's crazy, and that's the kind of stuff we're going to keep breaking down on this show. But I guess before we wrap things up, and that was a great edition of Lake Hotline. Make sure you guys keep submitting your questions in for Steve. But is there anything else the folks need to know before we wrap this sucker up, man?
No, thank you for staying this late into the episode. And I know these things can run long. That's just because we've got so much great information. Bailey and I are always looking for great guests. We've got some really great guests lined up. Of course, I'm traveling with Major League Fishing. The season's already started. I've done my first Minn Kota habitat restoration project supported by Kubota at Conroe. I'm planning my next one at Lake Murray. So I'm traveling a lot, but we are so glad you're along for the ride with us in this podcast journey. Um, if you've got questions, please send them to us. I'd love to answer more of them. Um, and if you can, reach out to these guests. If you're at Table Rock Lake and you want to know more, contact Shane Bush. That'd be a good start.
Heck yeah. Well, for folks that were tuning in, whether you're watching or listening, appreciate y'all. And especially appreciate you guys showing up for these real biology segments. Hopefully you are enjoying them. It's a great addition this year, especially to the OG Serious Angler shows. If you are enjoying them, any feedback on how Steve and I can make this better for you guys that are tuning in, like Steve said, let us know. But without further ado, appreciate y'all, and we'll see you on the next one.